Welcome to the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this series. First, I want to thank my co-organizer, Diane Dehoney, Community Service Librarian at Paul Sawyier Library, for her hard work, and to Paul Sawyier Public Library for hosting us, as well as to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for recording these lectures. This is our fourth lecture and the second of the 2024 Spring Series, and wow, what a great turnout. Thank you all so much for coming today. As a reminder, our past lectures can be found on Cable 10's YouTube page at frankfortheritageweek.com or at pspl.org/FHLS. Today's speaker is a special one for me. When I moved back to Frankfort in 1993 at 11 years old, I needed to find a soccer team so I could continue playing as I had done in Nashville. Dr. Taylor's youngest son, Willis, was about my age and also played soccer. So we played in the same league and eventually on the same team. His older brother, Philip, and I met several times through our mutual friends at Frankfort High School. Later, around 2004, while I was attending Kentucky State University, I had Dr. Taylor as one of my professors in the Integrated Studies series of classes on the history of ideas. It was then that I was exposed to Dr. Taylor's brilliance and his mastery of literature, history, and philosophy. As I became involved in the local history and preservation community around 2019, Dr. Taylor and I became reconnected, and I had begun to read local history research, much of which Dr. Taylor has contributed to, and had also recently discovered that I too was part of the larger Taylor family from Orange County, Virginia, that settled Frankfort and all over Kentucky. Dr. Taylor's wonderfully researched and poetically written 2018 book, Elkhorn, Evolution of a Kentucky Landscape, had both breadth of subject matter and specificity on my favorite area of Franklin County, the Elkhorn Creek and larger Forks of Elkhorn areas of Peaks Mill, Stedmantown, Schweitzer, and Woodlake communities, where much of my family settled in the 1780s and 1790s. As a result, Elkhorn is understandably one of my all-time favorite books about Franklin County. And through various advocacy initiatives in which we've both been involved, I've also had the great opportunity to work with and get to know Dr. Taylor's daughter, attorney Julia Taylor. And so it seems everyone in their family, including their mother Liz, whom we all know from Poor Richard's Bookstore, also have a love for history and historic preservation. As I've said before, John Gray's historic Frankfort Lecture Series basically started the modern academic research into our local history, which led to the designation of our historic districts, the founding of the Capital City Museum, and the beginning of promoting our historic and cultural resources as major tourism assets. Dr. Taylor is an alumnus of the historic Frankfort Lecture Series, having presented on early Leestown, historic photos of Frankfort, a driving tour of Franklin County, the Palisades of the Kentucky River, and more. He has also represented the Taylor family's long legacy with our community at many major milestones in our community's history, including Frankfort's bicentennial in 1986 and the 250th anniversary of Hancock Taylor's survey of Frankfort just last year. He has also been one of Franklin County's most thoughtful, vociferous, and eloquent preservation advocates. In June of 1982, Dr. Taylor wrote a guest column for the State Journal entitled "The Responsibility of Owners of Historic Buildings," advocating for the preservation of the old Stedman Hotel, the former home place of Ebenezer Stedman, rumored to be my third great-grandfather, who by his mill on the main Elkhorn was the primary provider of paper to the Kentucky government for several decades in the mid-1800s until a bad deal with the Confederates bankrupted him. Dr. Taylor included the article as an appendix to his 2018 book, Elkhorn, and cited the demolition of the Stedman Hotel as a major driver in his support for historic preservation. Before I hand the podium over to Diane, I want to take a moment to read that guest column to you today. The responsibility of owners of historic buildings. The character of a community, in large part, is shaped by its past, the composite lives and actions of those who make up its cumulative history. Long after the generations pass, long after the events of people's lives are forgotten or footnoted in a few local histories, The buildings in which they lived and worked remain as testaments to their daily living, their values, their aspirations. Old buildings reflect the lives of those who lived in them. As the state's capital and one of its oldest settlements, Frankfort and Franklin County are especially rich in such places. Some concentrated in the historic districts of downtown and South Frankfort, others scattered through the smaller communities and farms comprising the county. They range from clapboard cabins and modest outbuildings to more substantial brick and stone farmhouses. Unfortunately, much of the county's past is hard to define because only a fraction of these structures still stand. Weather and fires have taken their toll. The 1974 tornado was particularly devastating. These are losses that must be accepted because they cannot be prevented. The majority, however, have been victims of human neglect and indifference. Many have been victims of the attitude that the old is impractical and inconvenient, even though the materials and design of many new practical buildings ensure that they will not outlive the generation that built them. Old buildings are an endangered species. As with the loss of a snail darter, a passenger pigeon, or a rare plant, extinction or loss of an old house diminishes our knowledge of the past, as well as possibilities for the future. Like nature, cultures thrive on diversity and succession. Old buildings give us the necessary reminder that we are not the first to occupy this place, just as the ginkgo tree reminds us that we exist in a continuum spanning millions of years of geological time. To forget or deny this is to be short-sighted. Few would deny the troubling uniformity and narrowness of much that is praised and justified as new. For these reasons, the demolition of another county landmark is cause for community concern. The Stedman Hotel, as it is called, is probably the most significant and attractive structure on Stedmantown Lane. It belonged to the family that gave the road its name, even though somehow the road name acquired an additional A. The house was the seat of the Stedman family, who, in the decades before the Civil War, established a whole community around the paper making mill that ultimately supplied all of the paper for state government and much of the newsprint of Frankfort publishers. In 1959, the Reminiscences of Ebenezer Hiram Stedman was printed in Bluegrass Craftsman, a book published by the University Press of Kentucky, now out of print. The Reminiscences are an account of the Stedman family's migration to Franklin County in the early decades of the 19th century. In 1833, the Stedmans acquired a mill site on Elkhorn Creek where Stedmantown gradually formed as the paper-making business flourished. Several times, Ebenezer Stedman mentions the Stedman House, the site of which he refers to as Old Mount Pleasant. Quote, "We arrived at home, and as always is the case, home sweet home is the best of all homes. Old Mount Pleasant home begins this year to show what industry will do for a place. A new home is on the hill where stood the old sheep ranch. A new fence is around the house. The pasture that had so long remained a commons for all the cattle hogs and sheep now is fenced in. Sam Stedman's log cabin is still there." Bluegrass Craftsman, page 174. Until recently, anyone passing along Stedmantown Lane during the last 100 years could recognize the same house on the bluff above Elkhorn Creek. The rights of property owners to do with their property as they wish is a cherished precept in Anglo-American law. With few exceptions, a person can use or abuse his land and the structures on it any way he sees fit. Reluctant to infringe on the rights of property owners, lawmakers have been slow to recognize the interest of the community in preserving its landmarks. It's true that the federal government awards some tax relief to individuals who wish to rehabilitate old buildings. It's also true that persons who tear down historic buildings can claim no tax credits for the cost of demolition. Still, More positive incentives are needed to persuade owners that they and the community stand to profit by preserving their common heritage. The problem is not new. Sawyier du Prairie, the garden showplace of the bluegrass during the early years of the 19th century, was virtually wrecked by a spiteful owner who acquired the property at auction and used one of the main buildings as a cow barn. Whitehall, the home of Cassius Clay, and now a state shrine, suffered similar abuse. A person may act freely so long as he doesn't injure the life or property of others. The law provides protection against measurable hurts. Unfortunately, the extent to which a county, a city, or a neighborhood is damaged by the destruction of its historic buildings is not so easily measured. Though the community has a valid interest in the preservation of the landmarks that define it, there is no legal remedy. But we all know the difference between communities in which the past has been lovingly and usefully preserved and those which the past has been destroyed, or those that are too recent to have one. And we all sense, I hope, the terrible sterility of an area in which its connections to the past are erased or emasculated, the standardized blandness that describes too much of our modern landscape, where things look just about the same as they do everywhere. With so much of our past passing, we need to develop new attitudes about ownership. Owning property, especially historical landmarks like the Stedman Hotel, is a kind of trust in which the entire community are beneficiaries. The terms of this trust are that owners entail responsibility to improve or at least maintain the property so it may be passed intact to others. There is a corollary duty not to reduce its material, historical, or aesthetic value. At present, there is no penalty for violation of this trust, nor perhaps, given the tradition of ownership in our society, should there be. This emphasis should be on the inducements and positive incentives for the owners to preserve their property. Make preservation pay. Owning property is a responsibility as well as a privilege. If the owner does not wish to maintain or utilize the property he owns, it should be sold or leased to those who will. Owners should enlist the advice and aid of organizations like the State Heritage Division, Franklin County Trust, or Historic Frankfort. It is probably too late to save the Stedman House, but it is not too late for interested individuals and local government through regulation or informal consultation to prevent other such losses. The passing of the Stedman Hotel diminishes all of us, but the greatest loss is to the generations to come, who will know the place only through books and records, or a pile of foundation stones strewn on the hillside. Please welcome Community Service Librarian Diane Dehoney to introduce our speaker today.
Hello and welcome. As John said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian here at Paul Sawyer. On behalf of the library, I'd just like to welcome you all out today. What a wonderful crowd. I would expect no less to hear Richard. That's what I told him, and he's so humble and wonderful. And he said they'll know better soon, but I don't believe that. So. If you have your cell phones on you here today, if you don't mind to turn those on silent or vibrate for us, we really would appreciate that. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started with introducing our speaker today. It is my great honor to introduce my friend, Dr. Richard Taylor. Dr. Taylor is the author of numerous collections of poetry, 2 historical novels, and several books relating to Kentucky history, including Elkhorn, Evolution of a Kentucky Landscape. A former Kentucky Poet Laureate, he has received 2 creative writing fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as an Al Smith Award from the Kentucky Arts Council. Educated at the University of Kentucky, he also, where he received his bachelor's and his PhD in English. He also holds a master's degree in English and a JD from the University of Louisville. Practicing law for a few months, he gave up his legal practice, a leave-taking that he regards as his gift to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. From there, he embarked on a career in education, where he taught at Kentucky State University right here in Frankfort until retiring in 2008. He has received publication awards, many publication awards, including an award from the Kentucky Historical Society and the Thomas D. Clark Medallion Award that he received for his Elkhorn book, as well as receiving a Distinguished Professor Award at Kentucky State University. He retired recently from Transylvania University after many years of teaching there as Keenan Visiting Writer, and he is co-owner of Poor Richard's Books right here down on Broadway and lives right outside of Frankfort on a small farm. Please help me to welcome Dr. Richard Taylor to the podium.
I'd be very curious to know how many persons in this room are related either to the Taylors or the Lees. Fair number, as I would expect. I want to thank Diane DeHoney and the Paul Sawyier Library for hosting this event, and John Carlton for creating this series of lectures. I want to thank my daughter Julia for assembling the PowerPoint. I am PowerPointless. And my son Willis for providing some useful information I probably would have overlooked. Thank all of you for your interest in the history of our historic town. Frankfort's topography, I want to begin with. Why was Leestown where it was? Why is Frankfort where it is? In the 1789 edition of the American Geography, the early geographer Jedediah Morse described the Kentucky River as having high banks, often with rock facings 300 or 400 feet high, some of them perpendicular. The site of Leestown was not randomly chosen. According to Morse, it was the best crossing place on the river because of its ford and the low banks, which made it a natural place for buffalo to cross it. And we need to remember that the first persons to recognize the value of this area were, in fact, hooved mammals. The riverscape we see now is not the riverscape we would have seen then. If you look at this slide, you see the dark hills in the distance. The riverscape was a series, the river itself was a series of pools and shows, unlike what we see just out the window. The historian Arnold Toynbee said that civilization exists with the consent of geography, and so it is with Leestown. I like to think that Frankfort is an enormous coffee cup. Before the 20th century, there were few ways out of this coffee cup. Although we have radically transformed the area until we've made it what it is today, with road cuts and highways. The natural way out that the buffaloes found was off of Rouse Avenue, just off of Home Street, fairly near the recycling center and the quarry that's located there. That was a natural gap. In fact, at one time, I looked for a photograph of it, there was a railroad trestle 156 feet high that crossed this gap. It really backs up on KSU's campus. Most of us have heard of, I want to show you, of E.H. Taylor. Old Taylor, as the many people who have sampled the product can testify. He's a person who modernized the whiskey industry, and this talk is not about E.H. Taylor. It's about what I'd like to call older Taylors. I want to introduce you to 4 of these older Taylors, active in the Frankfort area before there was a Frankfort, and 3 of them before there was a Leestown. Let's also add 3 Lees active in the area of Leestown. The Taylor and Lee connection in founding Leestown was very much a family affair. They were all related. I hadn't realized that until a few years ago. They were cousins. Hancock Taylor was a cousin of the Lee brothers, Hancock and Willis Lee. Hancock and Willis Lee were both surveyors, and they ran surveys together. In fact, Willis Lee was with Hancock Taylor at the time of his death, which we'll bring up in a minute. They were close associates. Willis Lee worked with Hancock Taylor and was with him, as I said, at the time of his death. Lee's own death would follow 2 years later. Surveying was a hazardous profession in the 18th century. Much of what I want to share is fairly new to me. The research has been especially tricky because almost incestuously, names keep getting repeated, especially Zachary, Edmund, Richard, and even Hancock. And much of history has not been connected among these individuals. Some of what passes for history that is wrong, I hope, does not creep into this little talk. The first of the older Taylors is a name most of us interested in Frankfort's history have heard, Hancock Taylor. This is a picture of I think a reproduction of the original cornerstone, which was erected in 1886 to celebrate Frankfort's centennial. This is the inscription that appears on that monument. Hancock Taylor, we're not sure exactly the year of his birth, 1738 to 1774, was born at Meadow Farm Plantation in the Piedmont region of Virginia in Orange County. The son of Zachary Taylor Sr. and Elizabeth Lee. There's that Lee-Taylor connection. He was an uncle of the 12th president, who was the son of his brother Richard. As mentioned, he was also the cousin of Willis and Hancock Lee, who established Leestown, the first Euro-American settlement in Kentucky north of the Kentucky River. Hancock Taylor was a risk-taker of the first rank. Paddling in a dugout canoe with his brother Richard and 2 others down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers on a 2-year journey exploring America, beginning in 1769, returning by ship to New York during a time when Daniel Boone and James Herod were exploring what was to become Kentucky. Bent on exploration and acquiring land to the west is what then Virginia and now Kentucky, what occurred between 1769 and 1771 as starters. They went to Natchez, they went to New Orleans, they went up the Arkansas River on a journey of exploration. And as you might guess, they were interested in likely land to acquire. Like many Virginians of the time, Hancock and his kin recognized that in a pre-industrial agricultural society, land was the chief source of wealth and a sustainable way of life. The natural means to acquire land was to become a surveyor. The brothers' expedition in 1769 began several months before Daniel Boone first went through Cumberland Gap. 2 years later, in 1773, Taylor accompanied a party of surveyors led by Thomas Bullitt. Many of you have heard that name. If you've been to Oxmoor Mall in Louisville, you know that that mall was built on land that was an estate belonging originally to Thomas Bullitt and the Bullitt family to this day. He also came with John Floyd, and I've got a picture of John Floyd somewhere I'll show you a little later. Kentucky was not Kentucky at this point. It was Fincastle County, Virginia, and Virginia's property claims extended all the way to the Mississippi River. Floyd was to become another casualty, another surveyor who was killed by Native Americans. All right. After the French and Indian War, in which many Virginians served, a proclamation was made in 1763 banning settlement of Virginia, the land that Virginia claimed in the West, virtually, as I said, to the Mississippi River. Under Lord Dunmore, who became governor of Virginia in 1772, a means was found to settle Virginia's land claims across the mountain. The solution took the form of military warrants for service to pay those Virginians who fought in the French and Indian War. Warrants for land were issued, and surveyors were needed to reserve plots in the interest of the warrant holders. Governor Dunmore had reorganized Western Virginia to include Kentucky as part of a newly created Fincastle County, making it ripe for exploration and settlement. The mountains were no longer a political barrier or obstacle for exploration and the acquisition of land. As the Western country opened in 1773, James, George, and Robert McAfee were among the first to take advantage of the opportunity to acquire choice land across the mountains. Meeting Thomas Bullitt's surveying party, in which Hancock Taylor was a member, on the Kanawha River, in what is now West Virginia, near the headwaters of the Ohio, Taylor was recruited to accompany them as surveyor. The party came down the Ohio to Big Bone Lick. How many of you have been to Big Bone Lick? Fascinating place. One of the most important archaeological sites in eastern North America. From Big Bone Lick, the party made its way down what was called the Warrior's Path. And if there's anyone in the room who can do a better job of pronouncing the Native American name for this, I wish you would come forward. I will butcher it and call it the Alananan-Awamawi. Following the Kentucky River, which they crossed to the west side of the river, and proceeding along the path 30 or so miles to where it crosses the Kentucky over a ford which Buffalo formed. I regret I didn't take a picture of a site I invite all of you to visit here locally. It might be the most important historical site in the county because it's the reason Frankfort is here. I'm talking about driving out, as I did the other day, out Lewis Ferry Road on property adjacent to property now belonging to Buffalo Trace Distillery. And from a high point from that road, you can look up and see the distillery itself, and in the foreground, you will see what is Cove Spring Branch, which, unsurprisingly, leads to Cove Spring and Cove Spring Park. Robert McAfee, recognizing the high meadowland as ideal for a town, had Taylor lay out 600 acres in 2 tracts, which are described in his journal as meadow ground. One tract began on Ann Street, which is where that monument appears, 1 block south of Main Street, across from the street now from West Banco, on the east side of Ann Street. His beginning point was 2 white ashes by the river, now, of course, long gone. The tract extended west for what is a substantial part of downtown Frankfort. Though Robert McAfee later allowed these surveys to lapse, this was the first attempt to claim ownership of land in what would become the capital of Kentucky. The survey marks would guide future surveyors in laying out their own boundary lines. When the party recrossed the mountains to the settled portion of Virginia, they found out that the surveys they'd made were invalid because none of them had been authorized by the surveyor of Fincastle County, whose name was William Preston, to make the surveys. So what happened? As you might imagine, they came back. Robert McAfee went on to Mercer County. Many of us have heard of McAfee Station, where they found land that they thought was choicer. And the story is that when they were at Cove Spring, there was a rain. And springs were places which were naturally attractive and essential for settlement. There had to be a source of water. During the night, there was a rainstorm, and the water, for some reason, turned muddy, which soured the McAfees on settling there, which is what prompted them to go farther south. Robert McAfee kept a journal. I want to read a little journal entry. Thursday, the 15th, July, 1773. Took a small buffalo path, which was about 50 and 100 yards wide. Imagine that. You had a road pre-existing in this area. He traveled at about 30 miles over flat ridges. We're talking about this path down the Kentucky River on the west side. And we came to the same river, Kentuck, he called it, and crossed it to the Sunrise side, and then 2 miles across to another bend. The land on the river seemed to be very full of beach. It's significant that one of the several existing houses at the Buffalo Trace at the Leestown area is called the Beaches. Many of you, I suspect, knew Alice Blanton. The Blanton house was called the Beaches, and I think there may be 1 or 2 beaches there left, but beaches you will not find in this area for some reason anymore. Well, the land on the river, continuing with this excerpt, the land on the river seemed to be very full of beach, and from that point I made 2 surveys near joining to the river, with about 50 acres of meadow now ready made, and there could be made 50 more acres with a little trouble, with bottom and upland sufficient with very good water in different places of it. This shows the original grants in Frankfort, which we're going to talk about in a moment. The party then, after these surveys were invalidated, Hancock Taylor came back with a party of surveyors the next summer in 1774. The party was led by John Floyd, and Hancock Taylor was his co-partner, you might say. Both of them this time authorized as deputy surveyors. The party split up. They went first to the Falls of the Ohio. I'm not sure whether I've got a map of that or not. This is John Floyd. Most of these individuals, of course, all of them, in fact, were pre-photography. Photography, as you know, didn't come in until about 1839. So you're not going to, if you see individuals, you're going to see either a fine portrait or a fairly crude drawing done by amateur artists. The party split up after the Falls, and Taylor left with a crew of surveyors into the central bluegrass along the South Fork of Elkhorn Creek. If you go to the forks of Elkhorn, you know that that's where the two forks of Elkhorn Creek converge, the South Fork and the North Fork. The South Fork will go into Fayette County, the North Fork into Scott County toward Georgetown. John Floyd proceeded to run surveys along the North Fork, and James Douglas, a third surveyor, went to the south toward what is Jessamine County. In fact, Jessamine County takes its name from his daughter. On June 17, 1774, Taylor returned from his own trip along the South Fork, in which a good deal of real estate was claimed. I think over 40,000 acres of the bluegrass, originally in the names of veterans or their assignees, veterans of the French and Indian War. So among the surveys was one for Zachary Taylor. And historians sometimes confuse this. One source I saw said that, yes, Hancock did a survey for his father. I've since learned who was not a veteran of the French and Indian War. But in fact, his brother Zachary was a sergeant serving with Virginia forces in that war, and he received 200 acres. And it's that survey which is the first legal survey of land in what would become Franklin County. The survey, as I said, was 200 acres, and it began just to the east of the McAfee claim, which had lapsed in favor of land in what became Mercer County. This, of course, was years before Frankfort became a town. On June 22, 1780, Governor Thomas Jefferson signed the grant conveying the survey of land for Zachary Taylor. I think we've got that. You can probably read this more readily than I can. And you see these wonderfully quaint descriptions of landmarks. Landmarks which, of course, have long since disappeared. I want to back up a minute and show you Hancock Taylor's rifle. It's amazing to me that that survived the ordeal of his death. And one of the reasons that rifle survived is due to a person whose initials were A.H., Abraham Happenstall, a Dutchman from New York who accompanied Richard and Hancock down the Ohio River and was Hancock Taylor's constant companion, was with him at the time he was shot on the Kentucky River. Hancock's rifle was given to the Kentucky Historical Society. You can see it at the Military Museum in 1926. And interestingly, it also was hung with Willis Lee's rifle. By 1774, Taylor was as well acquainted with the Western country as any living Virginian, including James Herod and Daniel Boone. By the time Taylor and other parties of surveyors reached the Falls of the Ohio on May 28th, they knew that war on the frontier was imminent. Not just war with England, but with the native peoples who, after all, were being displaced by settlement. They knew there were risks. They surveyed 12,000 acres, as I mentioned, between Harrods and Bluegrass Creeks, then went on to the Bluegrass, where the actual number was something like 47,500 acres surveyed. A pretty busy summer, you might say. This I included as a rendering of a Shawnees or Shawanoe warrior. We don't really know what these individuals actually looked like, but this is probably as close as we may get. The party did not encounter Native Americans until July 27th of that year, as they began their return to Virginia to record the claims they'd made. Their luck didn't hold. On that day, somewhere not too far from Frankfort on the Kentucky River, they were ambushed. One of Hancock's crew, James Strother, who was, you guessed it, another relative, was killed instantly. Taylor was mortally wounded with a shot to his abdomen, but for 2 days was able to walk. They were to have a rendezvous with the other surveying parties, and they were going to leave the state together to register these surveys. He must have suffered enormously. He was able to walk 2 days, and then he was carried 2 days. He ended up in Madison County. And an interesting field trip some of us took a few years ago was to see his grave. There's a historical marker right outside, south of Richmond, on land belonging to EKU. And at that time, we blundered through the woods for maybe a quarter of a mile, and we ran into a tenant house, and we asked the occupant if he knew of a grave. And he said, "Oh, yeah, you want to go over just a couple of hundred yards, you'll see a pile of stones." And this is a photograph. You can notice in the foreground the pile of stones that marked the resting place of Hancock Taylor. I think it's been a little better cared for now, and I think EKU has probably put up something a little more dignified, though I hope they keep that pile of stones. There's a story that his brother, Hancock's brother, Richard, came back from Virginia the next year to put the stones down to protect the body from wild animals. Willis Lee was not only a cousin of Hancock Taylor, he accompanied Taylor when he surveyed Frankfort in the Bluegrass in 1774. Even then, Lee must have visualized the crossing as an ideal site for a town. Though separated during the summer, Willis Lee was at the rendezvous point when his cousin came in mortally wounded. In desperation, it was said, he tried unsuccessfully to remove the bullet with a pocket knife. Hancock's loyal companion, Abraham Happenstall, secured Taylor's surveyor's notes, ensuring that all of the plats would be officially registered. Happenstall carried the surveyor's valuable record book, of which they made a second copy to make sure that it got back to Draper's Meadows in what is now southwestern Virginia, so that William Preston could properly register them. In 1780, this is the grave marker of Hancock Taylor. It's on the highway. There was a wonderful historian. Anybody in here, he died a few years ago, my mentor, and probably, at the time, the great living historian of frontier history in Kentucky, Neil Hammond. Anybody know Neil? Neil was a wonderful, wonderful guy. He was a retired architect who lived in Shelby County and wrote a lot about, he was the expert on land use and land development on the frontier. He wrote numerous articles. He wrote more than one book. Here's the death notice that appeared for Hancock Taylor. This letter appeared in the what was called the Virginia Gazette, September the 15th, 1774. Since Colonel Preston's letter to you, we have advice by one Bell. Bell was one of the surveying party, who has just arrived in this town from Kentucky, that Hancock Taylor and James Strother were both killed as they were returning from the mouth of the river, where they had been to survey some land. Happenstall, who was missing when Colonel Preston wrote to you, is since come in. He was with Taylor and Strother when they were fired upon by the Indians. Taylor lived several days after he received his wounds and came with Happenstall and Bell at least 100 miles. Imagine that, with being, as we would say today, gut shot. Who killed Hancock Taylor and why? Native American hostilities along the Ohio during the spring and summer of 1774 commenced when a party of whites led by Daniel Greathouse murdered the family of Chief Logan, a previously friendly Mingo. Greathouse organized a group of men, mostly Pennsylvanians, to attack a group of friendly Native Americans at Yellow Creek, Ohio. Pretending to be friendly, Greathouse lured members of the group to a tavern, got them drunk, and murdered them. The victims included Logan's mother, his pregnant sister, and brother. In retaliation, Logan took up the hatchet and led raids across the Virginia frontier, murdering at least 13 settlers. These renewed hostilities precipitated the little war called Lord Dunmore's War between May and October of 1774, right on the eve of the American Revolution. It ended with the indecisive battle at Point Pleasant in present-day West Virginia. The deaths of Taylor, Strother, and Hancock Lee, I personally believe, and I think there's good evidence to indicate, were the result of this agitation caused by the murder of Chief Logan's family. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, sent Daniel Boone and a scout named Michael Stoner, later settled in Bourbon County, to warn the party of surveyors still in Kentucky. And Boone and Stoner made this incredible journey of hundreds of miles, and they found the main party of surveyors, but they missed Hancock Taylor's. All right, I want to move along to two other Taylors. Edmund Taylor, 1774, 1786, and Reuben Taylor, 1757, 1824. Edmund and Reuben Taylor, brothers, were sent in 1775 to inspect the land that Hancock Taylor had surveyed for Taylor's brother, Edmund. on the eve of the American Revolution. They came to the Great Crossing in one or two, fascinates me. Well, I should say a word or two about them. This is, there's a tailor, some of you tailors, aficionados, I've been to this place several times. It's a house built in 1722 in Orange County, Virginia, and it was the home of James Taylor Jr., the son of the first James who came to Virginia in the 1650s. Anyway, it's a fairly modest frame house that's been lovingly preserved. These tailors were on the same land. He was on something like 8,000 or 10,000 acres of land, if you can imagine that. This James Taylor was a surveyor. He was also the grandfather of two presidents, Zachary Taylor and James Madison. His daughter married James Madison's father. They came to the Great Crossing in dugout canoes, if you can imagine this. These were, I think they were walnut canoes that had been commissioned at Fort Pitt on the Ohio River, and they were simply hollowed out, and they could accommodate 15 or 20 individuals. They were commissioned. This is this place, incidentally. This is where both Edmund. The house was much more modest. It was added on to. Their father, George Taylor, the son of James Taylor Jr., had 10. Well, he actually had 12 sons. One died of smallpox. One was too young to fight in the Revolution. There were 10 brothers, all of whom fought in the American Revolution. The 3 Taylors I'm going to mention here fought in the Revolution. All of them were officers in the Revolution. 1 or 2 of them really were prominent officers. We'll talk about a little later. This is Midland Plantation, which was begun in 1786 and built by George Taylor. This house I wanted to show you is a log cabin that still exists, not in very good shape. My son and I have been trying to find a way to preserve it. In eastern Jefferson County, right at the Oldham County line, and it was a log house built by Reuben Taylor, Captain Reuben Taylor, before 1800. Anyway, this party, led by Nicholas Creswell. Creswell's a really interesting individual. If there's a book you should read, if you're interested in this topic, Nicholas Creswell came to America probably at the wrong time. He was a loyal subject of King George III, and he wanted to make his fortune in America, and while at the same time, at a time of ferment, especially on the frontier, especially in Virginia, as many Americans were beginning to chafe under the leadership or the domain of King George III. He was 24 years of age. He lived in this country 3 years, and he wrote one of the most interesting journals, 300 or 400-page journal called the Journal of Nicholas Creswell, strangely enough. And for 150 years, this journal was sequestered in his home in England, passed down by each generation until 1924, when someone in the family decided to publish it. It has since been republished, and it's one of the best early accounts of what Frankfort was like, or this is before Frankfort, what Leestown was like about the time that Leestown was settled. In his journal, one of the most detailed and robust journals of the early West, he mentions the brothers Edmund and Reuben, who were with him. George Rogers Clark was also with him, also looking for land. All 3 of these individuals, incidentally, were connected with what was called the Ohio Company, which had been started in the 1750s. George Washington was originally a surveyor with the Ohio Company, showing you that sort of appetite for land that existed at the time. Who were the brothers? Well, we mentioned that Edmund was one of these 10 sons. They went on to fight in the Revolution. They came back to Kentucky, and they came with Criswell to see land that Hancock Taylor, I think it was 2,000 acres, that Hancock Taylor had surveyed for his brother. And they wanted to inspect this land, and I don't know, I suppose think about migrating and settling there. After the Revolution, Edmund and his wife, Sarah Stubbs Taylor, and their children moved to Jefferson County to take up land granted for his service. The couple had 11 children, some born in Kentucky, some born in Virginia. Records indicate that he was in Kentucky in 1779 with Daniel Boone and others who were trustees in establishing the town of Boonesboro. In the first sale of lots in Louisville, Edmund, who was, all of these guys were on the make. They were out to, they were really fairly young men out on the make. And one of the things I want to apologize for is that there's not so much in here about the women who married them. And that's because I think most of them were having children. They were raising families, and they were raising big families. That's why there's so many Taylor relatives in this room. All right. A mover and a shaker, he was also a trustee of Transylvania College, dying in 1786. The account I saw says he died of the colic. And I know colic as a baby's disease, so I'm not sure really what colic meant in the 18th century. Reuben Taylor was the youngest of the sons I mentioned, the sons of George Taylor, and he was also, of course, the brother of Edmund. During the Revolution, he served as a captain in a unit called Moses Hazen's Canadian Regiment, strangely enough. And I don't want to get burdened down. Y'all are getting sick of all these details. But he retired in 1783 and married Rebecca Moore and immigrated to Kentucky in 1797, settling in eastern Jefferson County in the community known as Worthington. He received 4,000 acres for his service during the Revolution. Unfortunately, that land was in Ohio, and he ended up selling it instead of perhaps realizing a profit by living on it. What is less well known, is this connection he had with Criswell and coming to this area at a very early age. He must have been about 17 or 18, coming with his brother Edmund. And I want to read a couple of passages. One from George Rogers Clark. Clark was very enthusiastic about what he saw at Leestown. And in a letter dated July the 6th, 1779, written to his brother Jonathan and carried back to Virginia by Edmund Taylor, he said, "I embrace the opportunity of Captain Edward Taylor to send you this small epistle. Here's a little pride for all of us, a richer and more beautiful country than this, I believe, have never been in America. I am engrossing all ye land I possibly can. We have laid out a town 70 miles up the Kentucky where I intend to live, and don't doubt that there will be 50 families living in it by Christmas." This was 1775. Clark was mistaken on both counts. He did not come back to Leestown. He became embroiled in the Revolutionary War. He became the conqueror of the old Northwest Territory, and at the same time became the de facto founder of Louisville, Kentucky. He never made it back. All right. History is too often a distant view constructed of names, dates, and events. Unfortunately, what you've been hearing. Criswell's journal is one of those documents that historians draw on. His eyewitness reporting offers a welcome contrast to the facts, providing something immediate and alive. There are two passages, short passages, I want to share with you. Sunday, May the 14th, 1775. After breakfast, Mr. Edmund Taylor and I entered into discourse on politics. Sounds like today, doesn't it? Which ended in high words. Taylor threatened to tar and feather me. Obliged to pocket the affront, finding I shall be torrified if I hold any farther confab with these, I love this, red-hot Liberty men. Memo, Taylor's usage to be remembered. Nicholas Criswell's journal has recently, as I mentioned, been reprinted. It is one of the most interesting and earliest documents I know relating to this area. As mentioned, the young George Rogers Clark accompanied them, as did another individual who kept a journal, James Norris, another English immigrant who kept a journal. Interestingly, while the party was camped for the night, I love this story, while the party was camped for the night at the Great Buffalo Crossing, where that creek, where Cold Spring Branch is, the camp was overrun by a herd of buffalo crossing at the ford during the night. This is the earliest eyewitness account I've found of an actual witnessing of events in the area where Leestown and Frankfort would be formed. Most events in frontier history are described abstractly as secondhand. This is the earliest scene I know of which would become at what would become Leestown. This is the journal entry for Wednesday, May 24th, 1775. It also gives us one of the earliest descriptions we'll find of land in this area. Land in general covered with beach, limestone in large flags, few rivulets empty into the river, or few springs to be seen, which makes me suppose the country is badly watered. Camped at a place the buffaloes crossing the river from that side where the vessel was moored. In the night were alarmed with a plunging in the river. In a little time, Mr. Johnson, who slept on board, called out for help. We ran to his assistance with our arms, and to our great mortification and surprise, found one of our canoes that had all of our flour on board sunk and would have been inevitably lost had it not been tied or fixed to the other. We immediately hauled our shattered vessel to the shore and landed our things, though greatly damaged. It was close by the buffaloes crossing the river from that side and where the vessel was moored. Fortunately for Mr. Johnson, he slept in that canoe near the shore. The buffaloes jumped over him into the other, split it about 14 feet. Mr. Norris and Mr. Taylor's servants, and I don't think these were enslaved persons. I think they were probably hired to come along on the trip. Mr. Norris and Mr. Taylor's servants usually slept on board, but had by mistake brought their blankets on shore this evening and were too lazy to go on board again, or probably they would have been killed. Reuben and Edmund, cousins of Hancock, came to Kentucky on behalf of Hancock Taylor's heirs, as I mentioned. Time to hit another slide here, see what we have. This is, interestingly enough, a powder horn that belonged to Criswell. And it journeyed back to England with him and was in that country for a long time. This is a rather primitive but interesting view of a buffalo, early one. This is thanks to my friend Bill Penn, I think maybe somewhere in the audience today. This is his photograph of what was called Lee's Spring. And Lee's Spring is at the time, the part of the 1,000-acre plot that Hancock Taylor had selected for himself. And it's at the crossroads, many of you know this crossroads, outside of Midway on Highway 62, or Kentucky 62, where it intersects with the old Frankfort Pike, and where you see what's called the Cole Tavern, an old building which still stands there. But this is Lee's Spring, and notice again, these people are attracted to water, which was essential for farming as well as their own survival. All right, I'm going to cut some of this short. This is Commodore Richard Taylor, and he's the most interesting of these brothers, I think, 1749 to 1825. He was the sixth son of George Taylor of Orange County. On the recommendation of George Washington, he was appointed a captain in the Virginia Navy in 1776 and served until the end of the war. He commanded various ships named the Hornet, the Patriot, Liberty, and Tartar. Among the ships he captured was the Speedwell, an English ship, which was sent to the West Indies for ammunition and supplies so badly needed by the Revolutionary Army. He was commissioned as a captain in the Virginia Navy, as I mentioned. He commanded a vessel called the Tartar, on which his younger brother Benjamin also served. He captured several British merchantmen and was twice wounded, once in the thigh and once in the knee. The latter by grape shot, which went entirely through his knee, and which seriously, when he was attacking a British ship, and there's this wonderful story, it's kind of sad in a way, somebody on Taylor's ship jeered or teased the gunners on this British ship, yelling to them, "You damn fools, you're shooting too high." At which point they adjusted their aim, which led to this severe, eventually mortal injury suffered by Commodore Taylor. The wound never healed and was eventually the cause of Taylor's death 44 years later. At the end of the war, he was made chief naval, and it's incidentally, this individual is he would have been either the grandfather or great-grandfather of E.H. Taylor Jr., the Whiskey Taylor. At the end of the war, he was made chief naval officer of the Virginia Navy and given the honorific title of Commodore. I don't think he was ever officially a Commodore, but it's like once you're a Kentucky colonel, people call you colonel for a lifetime, right? Or governor, you name it. He served in that capacity until 1789 when he moved to Kentucky about 20 miles east of Louisville, not far from Goshen, and he built what is now Oldham County, and he built a house no longer standing called Woodlawn on the Ohio River close to West Point, and as I mentioned, Goshen. Now, more locally, many of us have probably seen this house. It's not on the regular tour, I don't think, at Buffalo Trace, but this house was built either by or for Commodore Richard Taylor when our first governor, Isaac Shelby, hired him to channelize the river. As I mentioned, the river was a series of shoals and pools. It was not navigable for commercial traffic. And the governor saw that there were possibilities of perhaps clearing some of the debris or finding a way where boats with a greater draft could carry Kentucky produce to the south. This house was built, it's called Riverview. It's on, as I mentioned, the Buffalo Trace property. At the time, it was a one-story house. It was later added on to, and you get a sense of it's one of the oldest buildings in our county. All right. Interestingly, we all know about, you might, if you go in front of Liberty Hall, you'll see the marker when Lafayette came to visit the Browns at Liberty Hall. Well, one of my Taylor relatives here in town asked me recently, well, what Taylors did he visit? Did he visit Commodore Richard Taylor? Well, Richard Taylor wasn't living here then, but when Lafayette made his tour of Kentucky, Louisville and Lexington and Frankfort and other areas, he made it a point to go to the farm of Commodore Richard Taylor. They had served together, and they were both founding members of the oldest patriotic group in America called the Order of the Cincinnati, a group which was founded by George Washington really as a support group for officers and their widows who survived the Revolution, to sort of take care of each other, and that organization exists today. I'm going to try to hurry this up. I realize we're going a long time. Richard Taylor died at age 76. His last words are said to have been, "The ship is foundering, but the cargo is saved." Now, I want to mention, this is his, my son and I, a couple of years ago, visited the house is long gone, but this is his grave marker, and this is my son, his wife, Lucy, and my grandson visiting the grave, which you can see is in there's a little fence built around it. The Daughters of the American Revolution constructed this fence long after, I'm sure, he was in the ground. Now, I don't want to, this might be a good point to stop, but I want to mention that there were two Richard Taylors. He had 10 or 12 children too, as Commodore Richard did, and he named two of them Richard. The first, interestingly enough, and this is not to stir up scandal, was illegitimate. We don't know that this Richard was before he married, and the child was by an unidentified, what I found is unidentified woman, and they had these wonderfully interesting nicknames. They came to Frankfort. They lived. They both sons, and this is Black Dick Taylor, and he was called Black Dick because he had a kind of dark complexion, and the illegitimate Taylor, Hopping Dick, got his name from the Indian Wars when he served with George Rogers Clark and Taylor's had a way of getting shot in the leg. He was shot, and he had a very strange gait, which is why, rather uncharitably, he was known as Hopping Dick, and insensitively, I might add. This is another view of him. Both of these guys built houses on what is now the Buffalo Trace property. Hopping Dick built one called Bellefonte, which was next to the spring, which still exists at Buffalo Trace. The other brother built one called Stony Point, which is currently where the stone house has been built at the top of the hill above Buffalo Trace. They were both very active in civic affairs, pretty interesting guys. This is a little family tree of tailors associated with Leestown, and it's in a little book. In fact, pardon the commercial. I brought a few copies of this book, and I understand they're the last copies of it around. We got them the other day. They're probably not going to be republished if any of you are interested. But there's a mistake I noticed. Edmund Taylor died in 1786, not 1784. That was a lapse on the part of the author, who'd probably had one glass of wine too many. This is this goes into the Lees, and I might just, you all been here too long, or I know, but you want to go on? All right, let's talk about Lees, finally. I'll make it, it's pretty brief. This is a map of Leestown in its relation to the river. You know, the name Lee has always been interesting to me. You know the word, it's spelled L-E-E, of course, but it actually derives from an English word, a place name called L-E-A, which means meadow. And it's always struck me as ironic that the Lees, whose name means meadow, came to a place described as a vast meadowland. As I mentioned earlier, Hancock's mother's maiden name was Lee, the same family of Lees as Hancock and Willis, making them cousins. The formation of Leestown was very much a family affair. The Lees were agents of the Ohio Company, founded by a group, as I mentioned, of investors interested in incorporating land and selling it in what was called, quaintly enough, the Western Waters. That's what they called us back east, lands upon the Western Waters. Willis Lee was born in 1745 in what is now, I'll mispronounce this, Sawyier County, Virginia. He and his brother Hancock came to Kentucky to conduct surveys, as I mentioned, for the Ohio Company. He must have known George Washington because, as mentioned, George Washington was also, as a young man, a surveyor for the Ohio Company. The lust for land was a motivator for young men on the make in Virginia. And maybe that's what all of these people share in common. They were on the make after a fortune. In relation to the Lees, Nicholas Criswell has a charming entry in his journal relating to the Lees. Went to Captain Lee's, this is 1775, June the 12th. Went to Captain Lee's camp, who treated me very kindly with a dram of whiskey, probably not bourbon whiskey, which at this time is a great luxury with me. Captain Lee's brother gave me a rattlesnake skin, 4 feet long, very hot. Early on, it seems, the area was associated with whiskey, though probably not bourbon at this point. In April of 1776, a group of Native Americans said to be Mingos, an independent band who were sort of an offshoot of the Shawnees, attacked and burned several cabins at Leestown. During the attack, Willis Lee was killed and others were wounded, causing the village, understandably, to be abandoned for at least for a year. The village was to encounter problems during the formative years. Growth was slow. Early settlers used the place as a stopover on the way to Harrodsburg and Boonesboro. As the first settlement north of the Kentucky River, it was always under threat of attack. It was, if you look geographically, Leestown was the point that was the shortest distance from the Ohio River, and most of these native peoples lived to the north of the Ohio River, Chillicothe and other places. All right. Leestown was never densely populated. As I mentioned, it was a way station. It did have commercial value, as it does now, of course. Hancock Lee recognized that it was a stopping place. After Willis Lee's death in 1776, it was abandoned, as I mentioned. It never quite got its steam again. Though a warehouse was built for products to be shipped downriver, it was really absorbed by Frankfort. Frankfort, which was, our founding date is 1786, but it was really beginning to be settled by about 1782. The war in the East and increased hostilities from Native Americans, who were, after all, fighting for their homeland, showed or slowed immigration, as did the harsh winter of 1778, in which the Kentucky River froze and game was extremely scarce. It underwent a slow eclipse after James Wilkinson founded Frankfort in 1786. It was later swallowed by Frankfort, as I mentioned, as roads out of Frankfort sort of bypassed Leestown. All right, one last individual. Well, I say that. Hancock Lee had a brother named John Lee. I don't know that John Lee ever came to Kentucky, but he had a child named Willis Atwell Lee. And in the 1790s, Atwell Lee was given an acre of land out of love by his uncle. And on that property, he built, which is now the site of Glen Willis and Limewater Restaurant, he built a cabin in the 1790s. In 1815, he built I think it was a one story of the two stories you see at Glen Willis now. His mother had died at his birth, and he was more or less adopted by Hancock Taylor. He was, as a child, Commodore Richard Taylor was still living there, and he was referred to as Uncle Commodore. I felt that was kind of charming. He married a Polly McAfee in 1797. They had at least one daughter. He was popular in Frankfort, serving as clerk of the county in general court and clerk of the Senate of Kentucky, all of which positions he held at the time of his death. He died rather young, at 49 years of age, of cholera in this case, and his property was purchased by Humphrey Marshall. Someone, I hope at some point, will give a talk on Humphrey Marshall, who's one of the most interesting and controversial of local figures. He was a Federalist at a time when persons were Jeffersonian Democrats. He was also feisty, combative, enormously rich. He wrote the first history of Kentucky, published in 1812, and again in another edition in 1824. He was not a very likable individual either, from all accounts, but he was also brilliant and important historically. Let me end with just a paragraph here. Maybe the settlement of Leestown was ahead of its time. A bridge too far, a town too soon, so to speak. Coming at a time of turmoil on the frontier that rippled west from the conflicts in the East in the struggle to make a new nation. The deaths of Hancock Taylor and Willis Lee and others of their contemporaries marked in Kentucky the beginning of a protracted war with Native Americans that would last long after the American Revolution. until the 1790s, and arguably until the War of 1812, which claimed, among other lives, the life of the great Native American leader, Tecumseh. Among those who paid the price were those who came out first: surveyors, Willis Lee, Hancock Taylor, John Floyd. These were young men out to make a future and a fortune. What they accomplished was to help open the floodgate of settlement in Kentucky, a course that would be rapid and bloody. The menace of hostile raids would continue within Franklin County until 1792, when the last raid by Native Americans occurred on Elkhorn Creek at the Cook and Innis settlements in the spring of 1792. The threat of North American Indians or North American peoples in Kentucky lasted until the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which pretty much ended the threat of incursions in Kentucky. Leestown and Frankfort, as well as the individuals whose lives I've tried to sketch, are undeniably an important part of our city's history, our state's history, and our nation's history. Thank you very much. You've been very patient. Thank you.
We've got about 10 minutes for some question and answer time, if you all would like to have a few questions. We normally have a smaller crowd, so it can go a little longer, but if you all have a few questions, feel free right now.
Anybody?
And,
Lada?
Do you have a microphone?
Yeah. I've always wondered exactly where Leestown was. According to that map, is it across from Block 4, across the river?
Roughly, yeah. I think you get an accurate, and I don't think any of us know precisely where it was, but we know it was adjacent to the mouth of Cold Spring Branch. So I'd suggest you drive out Lewis Ferry Road, and you'll see that creek, and you know that it was nearby. The river, as I said, doesn't look the way it does now, and it was probably the surface of the water was lower. And apparently these flags of limestone, in effect, you had a perfect landing place. And it was the one place where the banks were not steep. It's where, again, where Toynbee's statement about civilization permitting or consenting, civilizations existing with the consent of geography. Geography played a role in this town being where it is. Anyone else?
If you raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic so everyone can hear you. Over here.
Okay.
Was there one over here? Oh, maybe not. Oh, there you go. Here you go.
I've always wondered, is it true that Frankfort was actually Frank Ford?
Yeah.
That is-
Stephen Frank, a German immigrant, was killed at the mouth of Benson Creek. You know, I don't know precisely the date, but that Fords were enormously important. And stupid me, I didn't learn until recently. I said, well, why did the buffalo happen to cross at Frankfort? I mean, did they know it was going to be a lovely community? They crossed here because it is erosion. Creeks wash out materials which made the course of the river shallower and provided a place that these creatures, I don't think buffalo can swim. Maybe they can. Can they? All right. That where buffalo could readily cross. The other place to see, if you haven't seen it, is drive back behind the recycling center. I hope all of us visit the recycling center often. I'm there about 2 or 3 times a week. You can see that gap, and that gap was incredibly important because it gave Buffalo, it formed the roads. Leestown Road, 421, and 460 are really the remains of Buffalo roads. And it turns out that though they hadn't graduated from college as engineers, Buffaloes were pretty good engineers. They took a straight route, they took the easiest route with the minimum grade.
That was 1770 steel frame.
Yeah.
This is a bit off subject, but did Humphrey Marshall end his days in Frankfort?
Oh, I think he did. I know he fought a duel with Henry Clay, wounding Henry Clay so that he had a leg shot that affected his gait as well. You know, apparently that was sort of a fashion in the times. Don't kill him, maim him. You know, I don't know. I think he did die here, but he was sort of a curmudgeon in his way. I mean, maybe I'm a little biased, but he was very involved in the so-called Burr conspiracy, which came a little later. And he was extremely unpopular here, mainly because of his politics. Yes?
Richard, there are a lot of big beech trees down at Capitol View Park along the river.
Hot dog.
Huge trees. Yeah.
That's great. That's great to know. Yeah. Beeches are just, you know, beech trees, one other piece of trivia. Beech trees, the Danish word for beech is something like boo. And boo, B-O, or it might have been B-O-O, gave us the word book, because books were, in Nordic countries anyway, you could write on the bark of beech trees, as we know famously from Daniel Boone, who supposedly carved his name in beech trees. You know, D. Boone killed the bar. Here. Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to know that about. Those are old beeches there, Scott? Yes. Great. Great. They're great trees. I know, I grew up in Louisville, and if you go by on Lexington Road past the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, there is a yard, you know, acres that have a lot of really old beeches. And I always think of Robin Hood, you know, these guys jumping out of the trees wearing leotards. Thank you for coming.